Welcome back. I'm Joe.
Hey everyone, Sunny here. So after our last conversation, something you mentioned really stuck with me. This observation that Chinese official statements can feel surprisingly negative, sometimes absurdly contradictory, even aggressive almost. Well, you said it like a gangster. It sparked a lot of questions.
That resonates, and it's a really insightful observation because it gets at the heart of how complex it is to understand official communication, especially from a system like China's. It's definitely not one-dimensional.
Exactly, and that's precisely our mission for this deep dive. We're going to use the stack of source materials you shared to really unpack those impressions. What do these sources tell us about Chinese official communication and control?
And maybe what's going on behind the scenes to create that specific feeling.
Yes.
Let's dig in.
Okay, let's start with the phenomenon you first observed, the strong, often negative, and sometimes quite threatening language. You see this particularly from ministries like Foreign Affairs, National Defense, and the Taiwan Affairs Office, right? It feels like they're constantly on the offensive. The sources provide specific, tangible examples of this.
They do.
Like how, according to the materials, back in February 2025, the Taiwan Affairs Office criticized the U.S. for changing its language on Taiwan. I think it was on the State Department website.
That's right.
The source quotes the spokesperson, calling it sending a seriously wrong signal and issuing a warning, something like, no matter how Taiwan and the U.S. collude or play tricks, they cannot change the fact of one China. Pretty strong stuff.
And the sources highlight the direct warnings to Taiwan itself, too. For instance, the materials point out that just in May 2025, the Ministry of National Defense warned Taiwan's DPP authority that pursuing Taiwan independence will have no good outcome.
No good outcome. Vague but ominous.
And then there's that China Daily quote the source includes, citing a spokesperson urging the U.S. to stop adding fuel to the fire and stating, Taiwan belongs to China and we will never allow any force to turn the island into a hell.
Turn the island into a hell. Wow, that's incredibly potent language. The sources specifically zero in on those aggressive words, colluding, conspiracy, absolutely not allow.
Yeah, very pointed.
And they note that while the intent is likely to project unshakable firmness, internationally, especially in English translation, it can very easily come across as overtly aggressive, even threatening.
And the sources explore the potential reasons behind this phenomenon, often labeled wolf warrior diplomacy, which really seemed to ramp up in the late 2010s.
Right, the wolf warriors.
One key strategic aim discussed is, consolidating nationalist support at home. By being seen as standing up strongly against perceived external threats, the party can rally domestic public opinion.
Makes sense.
It also aims to project a powerful image globally, intended to deter potential opponents, especially as tensions between the U.S. and China and across the Taiwan Strait have escalated. The thinking might be that strong statements can, head off actions Beijing disapproves of.
So partly a calculated diplomatic strategy. But the sources also bring up domestic pressures, right? Things like high youth unemployment and challenges in the real estate market. Could this aggressive external rhetoric also be a way for officials to shift focus?
Shift focus away from those internal issues.
Yeah, by pointing the finger at external hostile forces.
That's definitely a factor the sources discuss as potentially contributing. Using external enemies can be a tool to manage internal discontent and divert criticism. It's an old playbook, really.
Mm-hmm.
Another point raised in the sources touches on traditional Chinese political rhetoric. Strong language, like issuing a stern warning, has a history of being used to signal unwavering resolve.
Okay, so it's partly cultural context?
It can be. However, as the sources note, when this style is translated directly into English, it can often sound disproportionately aggressive and lead to significant international misinterpretation. It might be heard as outright threats rather than just signaling firmness.
That's a fascinating nuance, how translation and cultural rhetorical styles can contribute to the perception. So what are the potential impacts of this aggressive tone, according to the sources?
Well, the sources suggest several significant impacts. First, it risks exacerbating international confrontation, just making constructive dialogue and cooperation much more difficult.
Right, it doesn't exactly invite friendly conversation.
Not really. And it could potentially push countries like the U.S. and EU to strengthen their own defenses in response. It also seems to increase Taiwan's alienation from the mainland.
Pushing them further away.
And perhaps most dangerously, it significantly raises the risk of miscalculation on all sides because intentions might be misunderstood due to the harsh language. Things could escalate unintentionally.
Okay, that covers the external, often negative side. Now let's look at the other side of the coin the sources present. the strict internal control, and the relentless promotion of positive energy.
Absolutely. The sources detail how the CCP maintains a really pervasive censorship system. This involves the Great Firewall, of course, but also the Cyberspace Administration of China and the police apparatus working together.
All to tightly control the flow of information online and off.
Exactly. Specifically to suppress criticism of the party or government policies.
And the sources provide some really concrete examples of this in action, like the arrest, according to the materials, of that documentary filmmaker Chen Pinlin in Shanghai. I think it was January 2025.
Yes, just for documenting the 2022 white paper protests.
And then there were those professors, Huang Yusheng and Lao Dongyan, reportedly had their online posts deleted or their accounts silenced in May 2025 simply for criticizing policies.
These specific instances illustrate the everyday reality of this control system. And alongside this active suppression of negative information, there's the equally active promotion of what the party calls positive energy.
Ah, yes, positive energy.
Which means party media, like the People's Daily, heavily emphasize positive news and deliberately downplay or ignore economic hardships, social problems, or really anything that can be seen as negative or critical of the party.
I recall that detail in the sources, how a party newspaper in January 2025 apparently described slowed economic growth as an excellent achievement. That sounds, well, like spin doesn't quite cover it. It's reshaping reality through language.
It certainly looks that way. And the sources mention other methods used, too. For example, the SEC has cracked down on what's called doxing, the act of publicly revealing personal information online in May 2025.
Which sounds like protecting privacy on the surface.
Right, but the sources suggest this is potentially a pretext used to suppress online exposure of corruption by ordinary citizens. Whistleblowing becomes doxing.
Got it.
They also list blocking foreign media outlets like the New York Times and BBC, systematically deleting critical social media posts, and even restricting apps used by ethnic minorities for language or religious practices. It's very thorough.
Given all that, why does the party go to such lengths to maintain this level of tight internal control, according to the sources? What's the driving force?
The primary motivation, as explored in the sources, is maintaining power and preventing social unrest. The CCP fundamentally believes that controlling information is essential for stability.
They fear dissent spiraling.
They fear that allowing dissenting voices to spread could ignite broader social turmoil, especially during periods of economic slowdown or lingering public frustration, like the discontent that followed the strict COVID lockdowns.
And promoting positive energy ties directly into that goal.
Precisely. By pushing a narrative of success, stability, and national unity, the party reinforces its own legitimacy. It's intended to encourage nationalism and foster confidence in the government by presenting a curated reality.
A reality where problems are minimized and achievements are amplified.
Exactly. It's a deliberate effort to control the public narrative around potentially damaging events, whether it's the economic impact of lockdowns or sensitive issues like ethnic minority oppression.
And they're using sophisticated tools for this, right? It's not just manual censorship anymore.
Absolutely. The sources highlight how China leverages advanced technology, things like AI, sophisticated social media monitoring software, and using phone data to track individuals deemed potential dissidents.
Wow.
And to ensure that only party-approved narratives can widely circulate. It's described as a high-tech surveillance state designed to enforce ideological control.
So what are the consequences of this intense internal control system? What are the impacts on the ground?
According to the sources, the impacts are significant. It severely suppresses free speech, obviously, but also the ability of citizens to act as a check on potential corruption or policy failures.
It makes oversight much harder.
Much harder. It makes it incredibly difficult for the public to access diverse viewpoints or objective information about domestic and international events. And this, in turn, potentially deepens misunderstandings among the Chinese public about the outside world because their information diet is so heavily filtered.
Okay, so we have this really stark contrast. Aggressive, negative communication facing outwards versus strict censorship and forced positive energy internally. This brings us directly to that fascinating question you initially raised. Does all the negative energy go to the officials?
Right.
Is the negativity that's bottled up internally somehow being channeled outwards through official statements?
It's a powerful idea, and the sources do analyze this, suggesting there's some plausible logic to it. The contrast you point out between the internal suppression and the external aggression is certainly noticeable, and it sort of invites this kind of hypothesis.
So how do the sources connect the dots on this potential relationship? Is there a mechanism they describe?
The analysis suggests it could be a deliberate strategy. By strictly suppressing domestic negative energy, things like dissatisfaction, social problems, criticism, and then directing that energy outwards by blaming external hostile forces, the party might be attempting to create a sense of national unity.
Unity against a common enemy.
Pretty much. The idea is that externalizing conflict can deflect internal pressure and consolidate public support for the leadership. Shift the blame outwards.
That would explain why they seem so quick to blame the U.S. or others for various issues. Are there specific examples in the sources that seem to support this possibility?
Yes, the sources note several instances that fit this pattern. The official blame placed on external forces, the U.S. and the DPP in Taiwan for tensions in the Taiwan Strait in May 2025 is a prime example. It externalizes a complex, potentially sensitive issue.
Right.
The sources also point out how domestic economic challenges are often downplayed or even spun positively, remember the excellent achievement line.
Yes.
While criticisms from abroad are amplified and used to fuel outrage. Additionally, circulating warnings about foreign spies everywhere, as mentioned in the sources, can also serve to deflect attention from internal issues by creating suspicion of external interference.
So it's potentially a tactic to maintain stability by generating nationalist fervor and projecting strength internationally, using external conflict as a way to manage internal discontent.
That's the possible motivation the sources explore. However, it's important to note, as the sources do, that this isn't presented as the only explanation.
Okay, what are the counter-arguments?
They also offer counter-arguments. They suggest that the external negativity could also be a deliberate diplomatic choice, driven primarily by geopolitical considerations and ideological differences. Maybe it operates somewhat independently of domestic control needs.
So just pure foreign policy strategy.
Could be a large part of it.
Yeah.
And they point out that some level of domestic negative discussion is occasionally permitted, usually on topics that don't directly challenge the party's core legitimacy, which slightly complicates the idea of a total conversion of all negative energy outwards.
So it's not necessarily a simple one-to-one valve system where all internal pressure gets released as external aggression, like a steam engine.
Probably not that simple, no. The sources conclude there appears to be some correlation that internal suppression might be channeled into external toughness as a means to consolidate domestic support and deflect internal conflict. But they are careful to state that is one factor among others.
Right.
Broader geopolitical dynamics, ideological imperatives, and diplomatic strategies also play significant roles in shaping the tone of external communication.
Understood. It's a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. Now, let's move to another powerful observation you shared, which really gets at the feeling generated by some of these actions. The question, is the Communist Party really a gangster organization?
Yes. This is discussed in the sources as a theory, or maybe more accurately an analogy, that views the CCP as operating in ways that resemble a criminal entity.
How so?
Using intimidation, control, and coercion primarily for maintaining its own power, and some argue illicit gains, similar to how a mafia structure might operate. Proponents of this view often point to the party's methods as evidence.
Okay, and the sources offer points that support this gangster view, right? They draw parallels between the CCP's actions and those of a criminal organization. What are those points?
The sources list several behaviors cited by those who make this comparison. First, the threatening nature of the official language, as we discussed earlier, that can certainly be likened to a gangster's use of intimidation tactics to instill fear and compliance.
Makes sense. What else?
Then there are the transnational repression tactics, often associated with operations like Fox Hunt. The sources describe these as efforts to coerce overseas dissidents, sometimes using really disturbing methods.
Like what?
They mention FBI reports detailed in the materials that describe threats, like telling targets they must return immediately or commit suicide, and the harassment of their family members residing in places like the U.S. That feels very extra-legal.
Targeting families. Yeah, that definitely echoes organized crime tactics.
Yeah, very much so. The sources also specifically note the reported harassment of Uyghur and Hong Kong activists abroad in 2025 as fitting this pattern of cross-border intimidation that feels outside typical state-to-state relations.
Okay. What else supports the analogy?
And the strict internal control via censorship, comprehensive surveillance systems like Skynet, and the detention of dissidents, like the Tibetan singer mentioned in the sources, are viewed by proponents of the gangster analogy as akin to a criminal group monopolizing control over its territory. enforcing absolute loyalty through fear and punishment.
Right, controlling the turf.
Plus, economic coercion is also cited, applying intense pressure on countries like South Korea during the TAD dispute, or on international companies like airlines being forced to list Taiwan as part of China.
How does that fit the analogy?
The sources note this can be seen as a form of punishment or extortion strategy, reminiscent of how a protection racket might operate. Do what we say or face the consequences.
Those points certainly highlight disturbing similarities in tactics. But what do the sources offer in terms of counterarguments? Points that refute equating the CCP with a gangster organization.
The sources present several strong counterarguments that differentiate the CCP from a criminal entity. A fundamental difference is systemic. The CCP is a governing political party. It has a massive hierarchical bureaucracy. It operates within a legal framework.
Even if critics argue that framework is used selectively?
Right, but it has a framework. And it's guided by a complex political ideology. This is fundamentally different from a criminal organization, which is inherently illegal and operates outside or against the state apparatus.
So the scale and the official nature are key differences.
Yes, and the ultimate aim. While oppressive, the CCP's control measures are ultimately aimed at maintaining state power and party rule, not purely for illicit profit generation in the way a criminal syndicate primarily functions.
Okay, so the structure, the stated goals, the official status, all different. What else?
The sources also point to the basis of the CCP's legitimacy. While it uses coercion, its rule isn't maintained only through force. The sources note its reliance on delivering economic growth, like the reported 5% GDP growth in 2024, and extensive propaganda efforts.
The positive energy and socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Exactly, promoting that vision. This is distinct from the underground, often parasitic, and non-ideological nature of typical criminal enterprises.
And the sources suggest perhaps the analogy is just too simple. An oversimplification.
Exactly. They argue that equating the CCP to a gangster group oversimplifies its complex structure, its vast scope of activities, and its stated long-term policy goals. These goals are driven by political ideology and national development objectives, not just personal enrichment of its leaders in the way a mob boss might operate.
So even the disturbing tactics have a different context.
Well, the sources suggest that while the transnational pressure tactics are undeniably disturbing and raise serious concerns about state behavior, many countries use methods like extradition treaties or diplomatic pressure to pursue national interests. Employing such methods, while sometimes controversial, doesn't automatically categorize them as criminal organizations.
Okay, so where do the sources ultimately land on this gangster analogy? Is it useful or just misleading?
The sources conclude that while the CCP's more oppressive methods and the gangster analogy share some surface similarities, particularly regarding that transnational pressure and attempts at information monopoly, the CCP's operation is fundamentally different.
Because of its nature as a state apparatus, its ideology, its governance goals.
Correct. The source describes the theory as insightful in highlighting some disturbing behaviors, but ultimately lacking sufficient evidence for complete verification. It's seen more as an exaggerated analogy, perhaps born from frustration with the party's actions and a focus on its more coercive aspects, rather than an objective, factual description of the entire entity.
That's a helpful distinction. The analogy captures a feeling or certain disturbing tactics, but isn't a complete description of the entity itself. Which brings us to perhaps the most thought-provoking idea you brought up, shifting into a more metaphorical realm. Is China possessed and doesn't know it?
Yes.
This is based on the idea of the CCP not just as a party, but as a kind of parasitic entity or ideological virus inhabiting the body of China.
This perspective comes from one of the sources and uses incredibly vivid and, frankly, somewhat unsettling metaphors to describe the relationship between the CCP and traditional Chinese civilization. It's a really powerful allegory.
And the source offers what it calls an upgraded theory on this historical process. Tell us about that. It sounds fascinating.
It's a striking narrative. It frames ancient Chinese civilization as an elegant scholar, refined, steeped in history and culture. This scholar, according to the source, was then bitten by Marx in 1919.
A reference to the May 4th movement and the introduction of Marxist ideas?
Precisely. A period of intense social and intellectual upheaval. And then, dramatically, in 1949, after the communist victory, this scholar formally transformed into a proletariat zombie under the rule of the CCP.
The proletariat zombie, that's a chilling and deeply metaphorical image for the state of the nation under this new rule. And the source offers specific evidence one for this possession idea, comparing the Cultural Revolution not just to a political movement, but to a soul-clearing plan.
Yes, the source views the Cultural Revolution through the lens of computing a large-scale formatting operation. The analogy is that the traditional Chinese cultural operating system was deliberately wiped clean to install the party's ideology.
Like deleting the old files, smashing ancestor tablets, getting rid of Confucius.
Exactly like that. The source says it was about overwriting self-consciousness with Mao's selected works.exe. It breaks down the actions of the Cultural Revolution into stages of this formatting.
Oh, so.
Clearing memory by forcing people to struggle against teachers and even parents. Removing history by burning ancient texts and smashing temples and artifacts, and installing new software through constant ideological indoctrination and slogans like, "Long live Chairman Mao."
And the result of this formatting, according to this perspective, what was left?
The source says traditional culture was left completely unable to boot up. All that was left functioning, metaphorically, were the red big character posters as the new interface and the mutual reporting programs that emerged from the group struggle sessions.
The old soul's operating system seemed entirely erased.
Wow, that paints a picture of an intentional systematic destruction of the cultural software. Then there's evidence, too, using another powerful analogy for the June 4th Tiananmen events in 1989, describing it as a forced suppression of the body's antivirus response.
Yes. In this analogy, the source portrays the young people who demonstrated in 1989 as China's immune system.
The body itself sensing something was fundamentally wrong, right? Realizing, hey, wait, are we being parasitized by some political entity? The natural defense mechanism trying to kick out the virus, so to speak.
And the CCP's response.
Described in stark terms, a slapdown, using tanks to brutally tell the feverish immune system, essentially, you're just having a fever, don't need to think, go back to sleep, suppressing the body's attempt to fight off the parasite or virus.
And this suppression had lasting effects.
According to the source, yes. It forced China back into a high-pressure ideological oxygen chamber and led to further Xinification, which is seen in this context as solidifying the party's control and deepening its ideological dominance over the cultural and intellectual space, basically reinforcing the possession.
The source also continues the computer analogy by describing the CCP itself as a kind of gangster system software, with characteristics that maintain this possession.
Yes, it builds on the earlier gangster idea, but frames it within this technological metaphor. It's described as controlling information flow, like an old, stubborn firewall virus, incredibly difficult to bypass. It even suggests it can send landlords, a specific type of local authority figure maybe, to physically unplug your internet if you try using a VPN.
So bypassing the firewall isn't enough. And updates.
It only allows exclusive updates. Only the party version of reality or ideology can be installed or upgraded. No civilian patches accepted. You can't install your own software, basically.
And loyalty is enforced like a required software feature, a mandatory login.
Yes, loyalty binding. If you are not loyal, the system deletes you. You disappear, like an IT agent using Ctrl plus Alt plus Delete to remove you from the network.
Vanish.
Chilling. And the final characteristic.
An economic blackmail mode, both externally, binding other countries through trade dependencies, loans, tourism, and internally, using things like mortgages and the hukou, the household registration system, to tie people down and trap them within this matrix of control. These analogies are incredibly powerful, and they naturally lead to the question the source raises. Do Chinese people themselves truly not know they are possessed by this entity? Is awareness possible within the system?
This is presented as a deep philosophical and psychological question. The source uses the classic analogy of a frog in slowly heated water.
It doesn't realize it's boiling.
It only feels warm and doesn't jump out because it's been slowly brainwashed, maybe, to believe that the very process of brainwashing isn't brainwashing. The gradual, pervasive nature of the control and narrative saturation makes it incredibly hard to recognize the state of being controlled.
But the source doesn't suggest everyone is completely unaware. There must be some resistance, some questioning.
No, it offers a glimmer of a counterpoint. It suggests some people are slowly waking up. They start asking simple, fundamental questions.
Like what?
Like, why was the person constantly on TV talking about serving the people, never actually elected by the people? Why is it impossible to Google something like June 4th?
basic questions that the system can't answer straightforwardly.
Exactly. And the official response to such questions, according to the source, nothing happened that day, can sometimes be so jarringly disconnected from reality that it triggers further questioning. It creates cognitive dissonance, a realization that something is deeply wrong.
That defiance of reality, the gaslighting, becomes the crack that lets the light in for some. So, despite this intense effort to format the soul and suppress the immune system, what does the source ultimately conclude about the fate of Chinese civilization itself? Is it gone forever, erased by the formatting?
The source offers a surprisingly hopeful, almost poetic conclusion to this entire complex analogy. It argues that Chinese civilization is not gone. Yes, it is, the source says. It's still there, but it's hiding.
Hiding! Where could it possibly hide from such pervasive control? That seems almost impossible.
The source gives evocative examples. Hiding in old men in tea houses, unsent Weibo drafts, unpublishable comics. These are seen as subtle, quiet spaces where the traditional spirit, independent thought, or cultural memory persists.
Under the radar.
Largely unseen and perhaps untouched by the controlling system, like seeds under the snow.
So the body might have been taken over by this entity, but the soul is finding its way back. Or never truly left.
That's the powerful image the source leaves us with. It concludes with this moving vision. Perhaps one day, the parasitic figure in the Red Army uniform, representing the party looking in the mirror, will see the soul of Chinese civilization.
How is that soul described?
Described as being in a long robe holding bamboo slips, standing silently behind them. And that soul will quietly utter the profound words, "This is not your body."
Wow. That is a truly haunting and deeply provocative thought to end that section on. It really gives you chills.
So as we reflect on this deep dive, we've moved through several distinct layers based entirely on the source material you provided. We look at the specific dynamics of the aggressive external communication and how it stands in stark contrast to the strict internal control and the enforced push for positive energy.
Right, that duality. We explored the analysis suggesting how that suppressed internal negative energy might potentially be channeled outwards as blame and aggression, a tactic maybe, to deflect domestic issues and unite the public.
While also acknowledging that other geopolitical factors are definitely at play, it's not the only reason.
Exactly. And we delved into those compelling analogies you brought up, analyzing the CCP as a gangster hypothesis, seeing where the sources find surface similarities in oppressive tactics like transnational repression.
But also highlighting the fundamental differences the sources point out regarding the party's structure, goals, and basis of legitimacy. It's not a perfect fit.
No. And finally, that incredibly powerful, almost allegorical view of China being possessed by the CCP as an ideological virus, using the vivid metaphors of the Cultural Revolution as a soul clearing.
And Tiananmen as suppressing the immune system, culminating in that resonant image from the source that the soul of Chinese civilization might still be there, just hiding, waiting.
It really underscores that getting a handle on this topic requires digging into these kinds of complexities presented in the sources, looking beyond simple headlines, and considering these different perspectives and the often contradictory dynamics at play. It's not simple.
It absolutely isn't.
And if there's one final provocative thought to leave you with, drawn from the thread of these sources, it's maybe this. Considering the immense power of state control we've discussed, and the deliberate attempts to format culture and consciousness, is culture, and perhaps the fundamental human yearning for truth and connection, something that can ever be truly eradicated.
Or does it simply retreat into hidden spaces, like those old men in tea houses, those unsent drafts, just waiting for a chance to emerge?
Exactly, waiting for the chance to say, this is not your body.
Definitely some food for thought there.
It certainly is.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into your sources. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep digging into the material. We'll catch you on the next one.